section is a short one. And in fact, this is a very volatile or changing area right now. I'm probably not the best person to speak on it, but the developer is probably busy developing. I will be, for those that come to the application conversion class coming up, they will probably come in at that point and talk a little bit about what's going on there. But we used to have something called libmig, and that's what's in my tool 3.0. The only library call in libmig that's in my directory as well as in distribution is getParam. And that's the only one, that was the first one that we said, hey, this will help save time. And its whole purpose is to build a bridge between getParam calls and getOp, because it can be a major impact on an application to have to rewrite that module. It can save you a lot of time using a plug like this. The appendix in your back of your workbook, Appendix C, has all the hard copy you need for library calls that are not supported. And we're in the process of documenting for each library call what to do about them in terms of text and whether it's a throwaway or a rewrite, that sort of thing. So it's quite a task going through that many library calls and sorting through each one on a one-by-one basis, especially when you have more than one person involved in doing that. But we've basically categorized these into 4 types of routines. There are, first of all, missed library routines, and some people may debate about whether it's missed or simply an add-on feature that shouldn't be in a standard library but off on the side. But we have timestamp conversion utilities. These are typically used by operational tools. And the recent migration effort at Lockheed converted these to COS, or to UNICOS, and have them running in their accounting database that they use. So these may appear in libcos in 5.0, or they're available from the site. In fact, he said it was a straight port. They're written in Cal, and it wasn't any problem. And there's also bench lib routines, AQ routines that don't seem to fall into any feature list yet. And there's a couple of them that are back in there. Most of the AQ.io routines are there, but there are some additional ones that came from Pacific Sierra or some outside vendor that are on the system. And those aren't officially supported in COS, but part of the benchmarking routines. Then there are routines that I feel are COS routines, but we can provide full support. And these will probably go into libcos. First of all, tremain. Tremain is on the Cray2, but not on the XMP, except in 5.0 it's supposed to be, though I haven't tried the entry point yet. And tremain gives you the time remaining in your job so that you can do cleanup just before your job terminates. Then there's the memory call. Memory is a common one. It's been a popular one. There's been an argument over whether it's not Unix-like and whether it should be supported in the UNICOS environment. But we do have a routine to support it. And it was debated about whether we should call it memory or expand. And the plan right now is that we will satisfy it as memory, and that external will be satisfied. And this one was written by a site as well and passed into our libraries group and massaged from there, and will be definitely in libcos. Since that code's already there, I know it's in libcos. And we also have PPL, process parameter list, which is a way of processing directives the way products do. And I'm sure you could think of other ones that categorize in there. Then there's partial support routines, and these things are, we may be able to support it depending upon how it's used by the programmer. And getParam is one of those that we can support basic usage of it, but no guarantee in what programmers are doing with the call out there, because there's a lot of flexibility in the way you may find it used. And it may not be necessarily the best thing to use this migration library in that area. You may want to just rewrite the getParam to be a getOp, and it's a slightly different lines, but it can be. There's an example of it in the anthology, and it can be done probably within a day or two of serious coding to get the whole thing squeak clean. The assign command. The way we can support assign is with the iShell call. Again, all your JCL commands can be executed from within Fortran using an iShell call. And there's debates about whether we want library entry points for these or just use iShell. And the tendency right now is to make them change the line and call iShell to do fetches, disposes, assigns, copies, those sorts of things. An account table is one of those that is used to pretty up reports and put all kinds of nice headers and stuff like that on your pages. Presently, it is planned on having some partial support. Now, it depends upon what can map in the fields of account table. We're going through the call, and there are several different things you can specify and pull out of the account table. Some of them are valid, some of them may not be valid, and that's what we're looking at right now. What do you do if you're running the application interactive and you don't have an NQS name? Things like that. So that one is definitely being looked at, being supported in libcos. There's no code for it right now, and we'll see what happens from there. Routines that we can definitely not support, these are access. We can't support access, and it's already got an entry point. So if we could support it, we'd have problems anyways, because Unix uses access. It's a C library entry point, but it also has a Fortran or an uppercase entry point in 4.0. And in 5.0, I would expect it to be there as well. Get LFTs and get DSPs. Any CAL module that's doing I/O manipulation at the CAL level is a candidate for rethinking the I/O and looking at the way you're going to do it on UNICOS. You can't port a module like that. That's the kind of code that's been really optimized for COS, and you're just going to have to start from scratch. And you can't just port that library call. There's no DSPs or LFTs or anything like that structure in UNICOS. So there is a document, an internal document, that the person in charge of libcos is specifying which ones fall into which categories at this point.
I didn't quite understand that first category of mixed libraries.
Well, this would be things that aren't really COS specific, but they aren't in the release. There's a pack and unpack one that's missing.
Okay.
There's timestamp routines are debatable about whether that's a COS specific thing or just Cray specific or something like that.
So are you saying that it's questionable what's going to happen with COS then?
No, it's somebody simply, they've gone through this list and identified certain things. I'm just saying that out of the entry points we've listed that aren't on UNICOS, they fall into this type of category. And some of the ones that are missed are like some things in BenchLib, though that's AQ type calls and outside vendor calls and timestamp routines, things that some people may consider part of the COS environment, but other people say it's really a programming environment tool we need and isn't specific to COS. I mean, sense switches is a call that would definitely not be supported because there's no concept like that. So there are things that are just not COS specific. There are things that are COS specific. Things COS specific we can't do everything about, and then things we can't do anything about.
You're saying that live COS is going to try to address all those problems? Is that?
All but the not supported.
Okay.
We will not have entry points for things that are definitely not supported and have no meaning and no way of mapping into UNICOS.
So pack and unpack, we can expect those.
Most of the pack and unpacks are there. So again, nobody's really gone through the list. The developer has a tool that goes through the system and automatically generates the list of externals that are different between the systems. And this one person is putting together this document listing all the calls and what category they fall in and stuff like that. Not by this classification, but by his way he's classifying them. But there are simply going to be library routines that will not have entry points and should not have entry points. Now, the intent of getParam is simply to save time. It is not to keep a COS command line. The syntax will change. In this case, we have verb with commas, ended with a period. The translation of it would be -I, -O, -L. And that's what the parser is looking for with getOp. So all we're trying to do is make a getOp call and plug that into the getParam table for you. That's all we're doing. And the other thing he can spot is -I and -O have special meanings to them. They're standard in and standard out. So if you're using inputs and outputs on Fortran units 5 and 6 that aren't specified with the -I or -O, he won't recognize them as I/O redirection, which means you should probably go into your getParam table and simply change that field to a -I or a -O. And then getParam will know you're talking about Fortran unit 5 or 6 and can do I/O redirection on it instead.
You just gave I/O and L there as generic type of things, right? You can specify whatever.
In the getParam.f, I think, is where you'd find it. You'd have to look into the call and see where he looks for that pattern search. And he's looking for an I and an O. And if it's something else, you could go into that call and change it too. But yeah, he's looking for those key letters themselves. And nobody follows any sort of standard like that. I equals, I guess, is pretty common, but an O equals isn't that common. It's more an L equals. So it's composed of a getParam entry point. In the COS application, you're going to have some sort of equivalence that's going to equate what's in the getParam table to the variables that the Fortran module is using. And then your getParam call is what's actually going to make a call to the system to parse the command line and then plug that information back into that getParam table, which the application then through the equivalence and stuff can use from that point on. And getParam.f is the entry point at the Fortran level for that. And he has several subroutines for error handling and stuff like that. And then he calls getOp.c. And getOp.c is uppercase. That's how you call a C module from Fortran. You have to have an uppercase entry point. So the C function itself is uppercase. And from there, it calls the C library getOp library routine, which parses the command line in a Unix fashion. And then that passes all the names that have been set up back into the getParam table, writes them in there. So that's the only one that's presently supported. And I've used it a couple of times, and it got us past that call and on to the next step easily and quickly. So we didn't have to worry. We could come back to that problem if we wanted to. And I haven't encountered any tough cases. Though that scan program that I showed you an example of earlier is a tough case because he does some weird things with his command line. The next section I'm going to skip. You can take a look at it if you want. It's about a CAL conversion utility. It's basically a CAL system text definition file, $sys_text format file. And it's designed to map Cray1, Cray2 instruction sets. Does nothing about macros. And it's not an intelligent tool, and you're better off hand coding it. It doesn't save you any amount of time. It doesn't deal with macros. It maps B&T registers into local memory. And when you actually want to rewrite the CAL on the Cray2, you may want to consider implementing it in Fortran. There have been a lot of cases where CAL modules, when they ported them, re-implemented them in a higher level language to make them portable in the future. And that's a decision you have to make, whether you're going to let the compilers speed it up for you or you really think you can get performance out of that area. Again, it's always a balanced trade-off between performance and portability. And when you do this migration into UNICOS, you want to consider portability across Unix and UNICOS architectures. In particular, hopefully, UNICOS architectures and future machines that come out. So all CAL stuff I would redo by hand from scratch, consider Fortran implementations instead of CAL implementations, and do it line by line, hand code it. That converter is more trouble than it's going to give you anything. If you take a look at the output, you'll see some of the reasons why. shuffles things back and forth, plays ping pong with registers and stuff that is just stupid. It was a tool that simply somebody used once, and we didn't want to I was the one that got it into the tools release because I didn't want to see it thrown away yet. But after having seen how it's used, I would just as soon drop it. The next section is on the migration planning tools. These are tools only for COS. They're available on a COS migration tools release tape along with $dummylib and the COS JCL converter. There's only one of them on the tape, and there's a second one available here in Mendota Heights. And I'll show you the output from both. Originally, these tools came from a site in Europe that wrote 4 tools. They were an MVS site, and their job name was their username. And everybody had a different user compartment, so each user had its own ownership, and job name was username. So they had a very easy way of tracking that. And they wrote 4 tools. One to look at all the job names and how many times that job name was run. One to look at the COS JCL and how many times a user used that JCL verb. A third one actually looked at parameter usage and told you how many times options were being used on commands, but didn't tell you who used them. It just said you had this one used 50% of the time, this one was never used. And these tools are still out in a directory somewhere, but they've been dropped from the migration tools release for whatever reason. They weren't deemed necessary in the environment of planning for this migration. And they also had a fourth one there that looked at CFT compile times versus segloader and A.out or $ABD execution times, and gave a histogram. And that one was to look at how much compiling they were doing to determine whether CFT77 would have a big impact on site. So all these tools looked at extract output and just gave some statistics on what it found from that extract output. And extract was the one that analyzed the system log for the data. So page 12.4 is what the job would basically look like. On the release tape, I think it's split into 2 jobs. One to create the extract output file, the second one to run on that data, because the extract itself can run for a long time. So job, account. I turned echo off in my job examples because I didn't want to see all the system logs that I accessed. That was the only reason to keep my $log shorter, because all I was interested in is the JCL usage. We then run extract, and we're going to create an output file of EX file, and this is what we're going to assign to Fortran Unit 1. We rewind it, assign it to Fortran Unit 1, and then we do a CFT, compile what's in $in down here, and then LDR will load it and execute it. The file after COS JCL then contains a list. So we then invoke the execution of COS JCL here, and this list is referenced to determine particular users that we want to exclude, like COS archiving and stuff like that. Particular users that we want to select and look at specifically, and then the list of commands that we wanted to search for in that extract output. And this all came with the Fortran. The output's then, a sample of it is on 12.6. Now, I don't think this tool's needed as much anymore because there's an equivalence for everything but sense switches and SCOL and memory, those 3 things that we talked about before. Copy, skips, and rewinds, everybody's going to show up on, and I can't do anything about those either. So the only thing I might use this for is to find that SCOL user or sense switch user. Those 2 people. That'd probably be the only thing I care about from this tool nowadays. I just want to know who's using SCOL and who's using sense switches, because I've got to target them for special help. So the output of this thing then gave the UIDs that were excluded. If there were some selected, it would specify those. It then says the number of lines it analyzed, and there were 4,010 jobs. So that's a pretty good number of jobs to get a statistic out of, I think. You may want to do this on a monthly basis or a weekly basis or something like that. And out of those 4,000 jobs, 23 of those jobs used adjust. Now in UNICOS, you don't need adjust. It's a no-op. It's a don't care. the system automatically does the adjust for you. So you don't need that information. The only one you're looking for is SCOL and S-switch. But for adjust, it says 45 times and 23 jobs, who the user was, what the job name was, and the number of times that it was run. And then the same thing with assign and every other JCL verb that's on the list. So this was a concept picked up from a site that had an additional person get their hands in it and change it around to this format from the original design, and this is what's available on the tape. But again, there's a counterpart for everything in there except what we've talked about, and these things you really have to, deal with on a one-by-one basis, except for SCOL and S-switch. Find those people, because they're targets for extra work. Now, another tool that's been written and is not in the release tape, but we can get to you, it's called job size. And it was a request from a Western region site that said, I'd like to know about my memory utilization so I can plan my GOS times. And that's what this tool was written for, was to look at job termination records, and it gives the job name, time initiated, time terminated, the elapsed time of that job, and then minimum and maximum words. And then you visually can go through it and find the particular job names. It doesn't get you back to the user, but at least you can find the job names of the big jobs and when they run. So its intent was to help a site see what their memory utilization was like and plan GOS around that. I wish that the tool would also give the username as well as the job name, because that is in the job termination record. And then you could at least get one step closer to the person running the thing. But hopefully you have a user community newsletter of some sort, and that's going to be probably your best leading edge to find these particular users that you're going to have to deal with that are big job users or things like that. Front page headlines on your user letter. Memory size goes down 2 meg, and you're going to get people calling. You'll find them one way or another. But it's arranging with them and getting them involved in these decisions rather than making them feel left out that'll make it go smoother. You get more cooperation than retaliation for your actions. And many a site is in the newsletters put out, a year, 2 years in advance, interest in UNICOS and what the computer center staff is doing about UNICOS and evaluating and benchmarking information, things like that. Get them involved. The next section is on the administrative level. And one of the first things the site is going to have to deal with and go through several iterations on, guaranteed, is file system configuration. Nobody has answers to file system configuration. In COS it was very easy because COS treated all the disk drives as one big disk pool. And you had additional scratch drives and down devices and private read-only devices, things like that. But as far as what the system was using, treated them as one big pool and did its own allocation across them. UNICOS is different. First of all, you had in COS an EQT that specified all these. In UNICOS, it's in a module called conf.c. And you also, during your dev start initialization process, can change your disk drive configuration as well. Now, there are two common basic methods of configuring the UNICOS file systems. Now, I mentioned before that the file systems are really sub-file systems, and each file system is hard-coded into its size, and not one can dynamically overflow into another. Well, this is kind of showing the representation of two ways of doing it. The top method is more common for I/O performance. You're going to get I/O performance having a user spread across several devices. And this is a system configuration striping that's occurring transparent to the user. And that's going to give you a better I/O performance than putting them all on the same device. In particular, /user should be spread across because that has administrative and accounting files running, NQS and USCP spooling files that run on it, jobs coming in and out of the system go through USR. So a lot of the system overhead is in that USR partition. And then the users, The users are going to be using /lib, they're going to be using /bin, things like that. Now typically those are put on the SSD rather than the disk drives. So this method is probably more common because of the performance impact of striping each file system across the disk drives. And in conf.c you specify the disk drive name, starting and ending cylinder for each partition of your file system, and the name of the file system and stuff like that. So /user gets, for example, from cylinder 0 to cylinder 10 on each drive. And then the next file system gets from 10 to 20 or 30 or something like that. And you can see why it takes several iterations to get this file system tuned so that you've got enough file space without a lot of overhead to maintain that particular file system. A lot of sites created this /work so that NQS jobs, that was a scratch area. NQS jobs would run in there and have enough file system space to create all their scratch files, and then all of them would be cleaned up when the job was done. We didn't want that to start happening in the user's file system, because that's where the source is being maintained. And we had to separate the source maintenance stuff from the job run stuff to keep the file system more manageable. Now, one of the problems with this type of file system then is that if a single drive goes down, you've got every file system on that same drive, and every file system would be impacted. Now, FS offload would be able to move things off that drive into open areas on the rest of the partition. That's all FS offload can do. FS offload will juggle things off of one drive of a file system and put it wherever there's space that's not on that drive. Now, if you configure it this way, FS offload won't get you anything because it can only keep it in the same file system. The only thing you can do in this area is have CPIO and backups and things like that. So FS offload and disk maintenance is designed for this type of file system configuration. But you're going to have to FS offload each file system, and that's going to juggle all the files on that disk drive off onto the other disk drives. And again, with the disk command, the analyst or administrator can bring that particular disk drive to a read-only state, stop all allocation to the drive, pull everything off of it, and then down the device and make it non-available so that it can be serviced, and donut run on it, and surface analysis and that sort of thing done on it. Yeah?
Several of our larger type users, the modelers, do pretty extensive I/O, and they'd like to know how much disk space is free.
Uh-huh.
Blocks within each disk.
Within the application, or
Yes.
with what type of call, or how do they do it?
It was one that was written
In-house, okay.
This
That-
kind of restructuring thing.
Uh-huh. That's
Is there any Unix there?
not that I can think of offhand. That's a target for migration effort, something that should be marked with a bullet for being looked at. DF offers you that capability. I'm sure that the system is capable of doing that thing. You can write that code. I can't think of any library call that supports that right now. The C library may have something in that area. We'll have to take a look at that. I want to write that down. So, is it a percentage that's returned?
It's just number of blocks.
Number blocks available
Yes.
on disk call.
Right. I can't think of anything within Unix that allow you to do that.
Well, DF can return that information. So if DF can do it, a user can do it.
Okay.
And there's an interface there to do it.
Okay.
Because DF will give you how much percentage, number of blocks, all that sort of thing.
Yeah, I see it now. Question on page 13.3.
Uh-huh.
It's in the bottom of the third paragraph.
Yeah, dealing with SCM and update.
Yes, is anything under update format?
Yeah, libraries presently are under update format. iOS is under update format.
As opposed to this
SCM, right.
Okay.
And the kernel is under SCM format.
Okay.
And on the Cray 2, everything's under SCCS. And eventually everything will be under SM. That's the policy right now. Most of your products, your Cal, Fortran, libraries, iOS is all in an update PL format. The kernel is in SCM format. And on the Cray 2 they use SCCS. And all of them in the future are supposed to merge into SM. By the way, I did hand out man pages for SM during lunch with those other 5.0 commands and a list of all the 5.0 commands. You'll notice probably about 10 commands in the A's. They're all ADA commands since ADA's in 5.0. So there's a whole bunch of new A commands that are all for ADA. The bulletin in COS is message of the day in UNICOS. Tuning, SCEDDev is probably the biggest interactive tuning tool you have to balance batch and interactive time slicing. You do have configuration mods in UNICOS, but they're individual files. And the installation bulletins tell you how to configure the system. File system configuration, we see a configuration on page 13.6. I don't have text for some of these pages yet. But file system configuration is no longer an operator skill. It requires true knowledge of the way the system is configured. An operator just can't configure it on the fly like you did in COS. The dead start parameter file in UNICOS is not something the operator should be maintaining. That is something that the analyst or whoever maintains the disk configuration, who knows what disk drives he has, maintains it. It is in a new language called CSL, Configuration Statement Language or something like that. And the language is identical in conf.c as it is in the dead start parameter file that you specify when you do the start command. When you start UNICOS, it's the same way as COS. You start UNICOS parameter file, and that parameter file has the same syntax as conf.c in terms of configuring these disk drives. And we've got a configuration here showing an expander chassis, a buffer memory, SSD, and one DD49. Those are our devices. And the expander chassis, we've got a 15120 for size. I would expect maybe that's tape, I'm not sure. And it starts at cylinder 0. The buffer memory, we've got 512. The SSD, we've got 16384. And then that starts, it's got two partitions. One is for the SSD file system. And then at 15,000, it starts with the SDS. And there's no LD cache configured in this file system here. So we've got disk file system and SDS configuration. And then the DD49, we've got, it's a BIOP on channel 35, DD49. 0 is going to be a CE cylinder. 1 to 30 is going to be a dump space. 31 is a spare cylinder. That's just for emergencies to have a spare cylinder. And you may have several spares configured on your particular drive. Another CE cylinder. We then have the root file system, CE cylinder, what's called Scratch 2, another CE cylinder, user file system, CE cylinder, and something for Scratch 5. And they also show the tape configuration in here, but that changes for 5.0. Now all of this is documented in the SG 2018. And I've heard of sites going through 6, 7 file system iterations in 6 months. And in fact, 218 recently went through one, and everything was used to be under /t is now under /trng, and that happened over Christmas. That's when it really hurts, is when they change the name rather than just the allocation and the amount of space to your file system. But the hardest thing is tuning it so that you've got enough overhead space in each file system to not be wasteful, so that you've got enough overhead to do the things you have to do in that file system, but keep all the NQS stuff out of there and have a larger overhead file system for that type of stuff. Otherwise, you'll have one group, the taking a military installation, the Army fighting over the fact that the Navy's got more disk space and they're not getting their codes running. It has the other advantage, though. In COS 117, you now have the ability with RDM to set up a disk map of where you're going to allow the user to put his files. And that feature would be implemented as a file system configuration in UNICOS. You configure him to these cylinders, and that's what he gets. And permissions keep him out of everything else, or group type permissions, something like that. So some sites like it, some sites don't. This hard and cold fast, you know, this is the file system size, and it can't expand into another disk drive. /temp may be 90% empty, but somebody can't run an application because where they're running it's 100% full. That's the problem. So everything is being, NQS jobs and stuff are typically put under /temp, and that's where you put your largest overhead of free job running space. And these jobs are typically so big they have to run through NQS because they run for so long. That's how they can generate so much data and have such large volumes of disk space being used, because they are big jobs. The tape configuration changes for 5.0, so that is obsolete. So after a site is figured out, well, here's the amount of disk space we've got, we've drawn a disk map of all this stuff, we've gone through 1 or 2 tries of this file system, we'll have to squeak it from there. The second thing they're going to have to plan, and again, all this stuff can be done before installation so that you work these things out rather than on a trial and error basis. Come up with a realistic plan. Audit, going back a step, audit could be useful in figuring out how much space you need per user and translate that into the UNICOS file system as a starting point. The amount of permanent space each ownership uses in COS. And you may have to break it down finer depending upon how you're organized on COS. But after the file system, the second one is the NQS queue structure. And queue manager is the counterpart to JCFDEF. Anybody that's run JCFDEF, queue manager is what you're going to look under. And 13.8 shows an example of setting up a queue structure. One of the things you cannot do in UNICOS, though, is put it into a queue based upon the output size and the station ID. In COS, JCFDEF, you can say if the characteristic is that it's from this station, put it into this queue. Or if it's got this amount of output, put it into this output queue. That is not supported in UNICOS. Queue Manager doesn't support it. So this is a script that would go into Queue Manager, and it sets up an account file, /temp/NQS_account is where he's going to keep track of his job statistics. He's going to add managers. This is who can modify NQS and execute commands in NQS, and the person was RAA. We then create a bunch of queues. Now this queue structure is actually the queue structure used for that benchmark I talked about before. And we've got 6 queues here. They're just named ETH 1 through 6, a priority for each queue and the number of jobs that can run in that queue. And then we have some destination queues so that they can go from 1 to 6, and they're all batch queues. We set up some per process limits, nice values for the queues, per process CPU limits, let's see, per request, that's what that one is, per request CPU limits, then memory limits per process, memory limits per request, and then enable the queues and start the queues. And there's also the ability now when you create and build the queues up here, you can specify what order the queues are going to be sorted in. In prior to 4.0 releases, it was alphabetical. It went through the queues to find out the match alphabetically. With 4.0 now, there's a couple of options that allow you to specify the order that the queues are looked through, basically, to find a match. So Queue Manager is the command for that. One thing else that's probably going to be different on site is in COS you may have had 1 or 2 people involved in administrating the system. In UNICOS you may now have 5 or 6 different people, 1 in charge of accounting, 1 in charge of NQS, 1 in charge of security, that sort of thing. The operator functions, It may not all be one person, which a lot of sites in COS do anyways. A lot of sites in COS have several people across the system supporting adding new users and that sort of thing. Now with UNICOS 5.0, UDBGen is the tool to add users. UDBGen maintains the user database, which contains security information, contains resource management information, archiving limits, contains also the share usage information for a fair share scheduler. And UDBGen is similar to the RD edit command or RDGen command in COS. And that's all 1.17 capability. And with UDBGen, all of the syntax of the stuff is looked up on the UDB man page, UDB:4. That tells you all the things that you can put in and associate to a particular user. User trap says log everything this user does in a security log for me to look at. Number of retries before you disable the account. If they fail the password 5 times, their account is invalidated. All those sorts of things. Compartments that are allowed. Account IDs, all those things are in UDB man page. That's where it's documented. Now this particular script is going to be an input into UDBGen, but it was created by UDBC. I have a note here that's 6.0, but it did make 5.0. So that's an invalid comment now. So each one of these begins with the create and then the login name. Now this does not create the directory like you have in a standard Unix system. This just creates the user database. There's a second script called NU. And NU sets up the default shell and creates the home directory and some of those sorts of things. So you're going to have to use NU as well as UDBGen at this point. They've talked about wrapping NU into UDBGen, but it's not in 5.0. So UDBGen, we're going to create a login called FIL. His user ID number is going to be 64. I've got a comment field, and that comment will go into the password file. In this case, it's a name. I have a password file, or a password field. Aging on the password. The home directory for that particular user. Group IDs that that person can belong to, and also account IDs. And the new account and new group is what allows them to change between those things. So a user can use a new account command or a new group command to get between accounts and groups. There are a variety of other fields here. This example doesn't really show anything. So you can start building up this database long before you're actually doing the install. At least survey the users to determine, fill out a blank sheet for each user and determine on paper or online or build some sort of database with a text editor of this stuff so that the closer you get to installation, the closer you are to getting your template tuned for your user database. And that can save you time. You can come up to Mendota Heights with that tape if it's whatever format, come up, put it onto UNICOS, and then test it out. Run it through UDBGen and check for syntax differences. The next section was on resource management. I don't really have anything to add in there. UDBGen's still going to do it. But you're going to determine the amount of file space they get, the maximum time limit they're allowed, a variety of things that are all documented in that UDB man page. The next thing I have is, again, another pre-5.0 tool. It gets renamed in UNICOS 5.0. It is standard UNICOS 5.0, and it's called CSA FEF for CRACE System Accounting Front-End Formatter. One of the first sites to migrate was Harwell, and they took all their accounting information out of the system log and disposed it off to their MVS front end and then processed it there. And the first thing they found when they brought up their Unix-based system was that it was Unix accounting, nothing like what they needed for their existing billing system. So they wrote a tool, and this is what it is. It was designed to read through the NQS accounting file, and in this case there was no file, so I don't have a sample output from it, and also reads through that PHCCT file. Now, I don't know what sort of changes have occurred to this tool for CSA FEF, except I do know it now disposes or has its data format in SMF format, because there are a lot of MVS sites out there that need SMF records to run their statistical analysis tools on the IBMs with. So there are changes in format and stuff like that that have occurred to this. But it basically gave us the username, the job number, start and end time, and then some statistics for billing on user time, system time, I/O blocks, and SBUs that were associated to that particular task. Now 5.0 has a whole new structure. And let's see, I counted probably about 25 commands that seemed new for UNICOS 5.0. And they all begin with that CSA command. I'm going to get a drawing of what I figure out later in the week, but I don't really have anything drawn out right now. So this tool is gone. It only runs right now supported on 3.0, and I know there's a 4.0 version out at a site, but 5.0 it's wrapped into CSA FEF. I also mentioned earlier about using the system log in COS to find jobs that have run in the past. This is a sample of account comms output, and this is a standard Unix accounting tool. So based upon the username and then the time of the job run, you can go back and find the application run and get a little bit of diagnostic information. Not so much diagnostic, but accounting statistic information. I don't think there's any exit codes kept or anything like that that would be helpful. Also, starting in UNICOS 3.0 and also available in 5.0 on the benchmarking tools tape is a counterpart to DayFile. Anybody familiar with DayFile and COS? It's a benchmarking tool to look at job mix information. That's really what it's for. And it's called, I think, account bench, but it may be bench account these days. They may have changed it so that it's spelled the other way. So I saw something on it recently that had it spelled the other way. And this is what its output looks like. It goes through the same process accounting file that AccountCom did and ACCT did, the PACCT file. It just gives you statistics out of that. And it says there are 645 jobs found. I just truncated the beginning and the end. Gives you this period, start time and end time. Then for each job, the main thing is to tell you which are big CPU users, which are big I/O jobs, so that you can see what kind of job mix that you have. Useful to see what kind of homogeneous environment you have. And this is the only tool that is similar to the DayFile output. At the bottom then, it gives a CPU utilization. In this case, it was a 64% for 4 CPUs. One of the problems with this tool, however, is that in UNICOS, a process does not write a termination record until it terminates. And besides the kernel, there's all your system daemons. There's your file system daemon, your error daemon, all those daemons. The only way that their accounting records are accounted for is if they're terminated, which means in order for this utilization number to truly be accurate, you have to bring the system down, bring it back up, and then analyze that PACCT file. And then that number will take into account system overhead as well. Right now, this is showing how much the users actually got out of that system over that time period, and doesn't take into account all the system daemons. But that's the counterpart to DayFile. The next section deals with the file system monitor. This is part of the archiving system if you want to consider it that. In fact, I'm going to hand out some archiving stuff here as well. The file system monitor is optional. It's designed to be an operator interface to monitor the file system in case it starts filling up. And it can trigger the data or disk management subsystem, but it doesn't have to. The two can run independent or knit together. So the file system monitor consists of a file system daemon who's going to be gathering statistics from each file system and determining if they're starting to fill up. If he evaluates a particular file system starting to fill up, he can send a message to NQS saying, don't submit any more jobs because this file system's filling up. He can send a message to the operator through the MSG daemon and get an operator message just like tape mounts come up. Or he can send one to an FS-MON display that the administrator may have up and running. This would kind of be like the store display to show you how much space you have on your file system. It doesn't really give you read-write statistics. That's done with disk commands and some other commands. So the file system monitor was the first part of the archiving project, basically to watch the file system and to fire off an action like sending messages to users saying, we're 60% full, would you do some cleanup? At 90% full, we're going to start kicking in some sort of archiving or data disk management subsystem. And disk management is probably the last feature in the 5.0 system, that and ASG, that I haven't looked at. And this is still a kind of a preliminary drawing of what's going on with the archiving system and the way it works. And there are two other user commands that are not mentioned here, dm info and dm mode, that are also user commands to tell us about the files. There are four user commands, dm info, dm mode, dm get, and dm put. So what happens here is that either the file system monitor can trigger dm hit, and the file system daemon is the actual command that's going to fire that off. dm hit is then going to generate a hit list for that file system. And in the process of generating that hit list, he's going to generate this check at these .keep files. And that's where the user is going to put candidates that he doesn't want migrated. So he puts into .keep, don't migrate these. dm hit, some of these arrows, a lot of these arrows should be two-way. dm hit is going to call dmmctl. And dmmctl, dm hit, and dm daemon are basically manage in COS. Anybody that's familiar with manage. And these three work together to monitor the file system. DMMCTL is basically the coordinator of all migration activity, and when he does decide to do migration, the DM daemon is going to do the actual migration. In fact, DMMCTL execs DM daemon on top of himself. DM daemon then can call a media-specific process, of which you can write your own, one for CFS, one for a front end, one for Superlink, NFS, whatever it is. The one that's supported with 5.0 is for the tape. So the DM daemon, when we say we're going to migrate something, we're going to take DM TP MSP, that's what initializes the tape subsystem. And the actual driver is DM TP MSP1, which is going to maintain and use this volume catalog database, which is in the disk management file system area. So he's got in here a bunch of volumes that he can maintain. To validate that database, we have dmdbval for database validate, dm volume database generator to add all the volume names that you can use in your database, and then dmtp merge is what cleans up, the cleanup command in COS, to merge the tapes so that we don't have more and more fragmented tapes. We can merge them down into lesser components. DMTP get then is what's actually going to use this database and make the tpmnt mount command and actually issue the access to the tapes. Now a user up here, one thing I didn't mention, FS daemon can kick it in, or dmfdgen can automate the disk management system on its own. This dmfdgen sets up your thresholds to start triggering things and what to do about them, and maintains that in this file system descriptor. It may be an FSDF. I'm not sure. Let me check. I have written documentation on this stuff for anybody that needs it. File, which is going to be used by DMM-CTL to figure out what to do when the file system starts filling up. When it starts filling up, we generate a hit list. When we get closer and actually have to, rather than manage it, do something, then we're going to start kicking in DM free. And I think the way it works is DM free can also talk directly to the DM daemon to start freeing things up. When we generate this hit list, we put them into a pre-migration file. And they're still online, but they're candidates for migration. And there's a .dmprev file that contains all these pre-migrated files. And if the user does a DM get, DMM-CTL will see if it's in that pre-migrated file yet before the MSP, the media-specific process, has actually put it offline. So DM get is what a user or an administrator can use to restore things back onto the system. And DMM-CTL will check DM pre to see if it's actually offline or not. DM put is the final one. That's what tells the DM daemon, go ahead and migrate this for me. It's the same as the migrate command in COS. So that's the basic guts of the data, or disk, I keep wanting to say data, but disk management subsystem. And it's an optional thing. You could kick this off to CFS, all the different types of front ends that you want to support. There's some more things about administrative on 1323. I'm just going to point out on 1326, another place the site starts making their initialization. The dead start parameter file in COS relates to rc.local in UNICOS, and this is a sample of rc.local for the CRAE-specific stuff and the site-specific stuff. And it deals with things like NSC boxes or VME boxes, network daemons that are going to start up like CFS, USCP, tape is down here, all those sorts of things. So a site's going to go into rc.local to configure what their system's going to do. NQS is also in rc.local. So that's the closest thing that relates to the dead start parameter file. And those are the things that in planning your installation you can look at first. Things that you're going to have to work out with your administrator and get your file system, your NQS, your user database, possibly your disk management thresholds and things like that figured out. The last section I'm going to leave until tomorrow rather than go over today. Is that okay with you, Chad? Tomorrow morning for an hour? For an hour? Yeah. What time? Yeah. Well, we can just keep the tape running. I don't know. Yeah, it should be about an hour to go through it tomorrow. But, yeah. The last section is really talking about the migration process itself and just going through it in the steps that you would go through and what to look out for, the trouble spots to watch out for.
Migration planning, that's what we're going to talk about right now. And what is really a migration plan, migration planning process? To me, it's really spotting the problems before they become a problem. That's what makes a smooth migration. Being able to have some, hopefully, foresight into seeing where your real time consumption is going to be and where your real problems are going to be, whether it's internal to the project or outside, like third-party vendors, licensing, things like that. There are a variety of things that have held up migration at a lot of sites. There are several sites that are migrated and several sites that are trying to squeeze their last users off the system. So A lot of migration can really depend upon your user community, how big it is, where it is, if it's local or geographically all over the world, and those types of problems. So I've kind of followed every site that I've seen migrate from Harwell on through NASA Lewis, which is winding down right now, Lockheed, which has gone native, and these types of things, and watched for the types of problems, complaints, time consumers, things that hold it up, all that sort of thing, and watch for realistic time frames. And I would say that it's reasonable to start planning your migration process 1 to 2 years ahead of time, and you know, not on an aggressive schedule, but to follow what's going on. But realistically, the migration process really begins maybe 6 to 9 months before the installation, where you want to start discussing interactive versus batch and the various things that we're going to go through. And I've kind of put together a Gantt chart in both the migration planning guide and in the section that I'm going to show you that I think is really an optimistic migration plan. And it could be scrunched from there, obviously, but just trying to give some round numbers. And it shows a year, but it doesn't necessarily end at a year in terms of users left hung on the COS system still, because that's what can slow down a lot of sites, just squeezing them off as smoothly as you can. So this information has really been gathered from what I've seen from everywhere, and in every case I've gotten some sort of migration plan document from that site, analyzed it, and worked that information into this planning guide in this section. I've also gone to external sources. There are books on the market about IBM operating system conversion from it was DOS to OS2, for example. It was this particular book. And am trying to gather a lot more information in just the planning aspect of any project, whether it's a migration project or not. There's plenty of courses out there for those that really need to have project planning training, so to speak, as well as software packages. I've seen a wide variety of software packages used to put together these plans and to monitor what's going on. Myself, I used Microplanner on the Macintosh, but a variety of people have whatever they're used to. So the migration project really begins with organizing some sort of project team. These are the people that are on site that are going to be involved in getting this thing done. They may not necessarily on site be the ones that actually do the work, but they're key to it and wrapped around the decisions that are made in that process. In most sites, these are the workers as well. They are the system support people. Often a Unix support person is sitting in on this team for his Unix experience and whatever Unix network he has in the environment. And that's what this project team is. There may be Cray people on it, there may not. Typically the analyst is bouncing in and out because he's busy running the various systems that he may have to run. And one of the first things this project team is going to do is do a site assessment. What the heck are we doing with our machine? What type of local code do we have? All kinds of questions to figure out where are we right now with COS, and what do we use, and what's ours and not going to come with COS or UNICOS. And with that has been feasibility studies. Los Alamos has been doing feasibility studies with each release and making the determination, we're going to wait for 5.0, then at 5.0 we're going to evaluate again and possibly hand it on to our support people and our development people as well. They see some point, I think, seen some point where they're going to take UNICOS and do the final twist on it to make it their system. So the feasibility studies in some cases have told a site not to go on, and in other sites, let's go for it. One of the key things that this migration team in the beginning has to do is, why are we doing this? And they have to let the users know why they're doing it and hopefully get the users involved in that decision. It's a lot smoother to get a migration going if everybody wants a Unix-based system in the shop. Bell Labs did it very quickly, but it really depends upon those users that can really cause you problems. So getting them involved in why are we going? Is it just cutting edge stuff, or is it for features or Unix-based system to interface into the environment better? At some point, this team is going to decide that, okay, I think this is the release that we're going to go with. They may slow down later and decide to slip a release. That's nothing wrong with that. There are some sites out there that are presently looking at both 5.0 and 6.0 and looking both at features and just time frames of what they want to really do. And they haven't decided yet. So selecting the migration path is, at some point you're going to determine we're going to go and this is what we want to go with. And you can start the migration on one release and then bring your users on with the next release. I wouldn't consider doing anything prior to 5.0 because administratively it's a different system. And that's where a lot of sites need to put in their local code and stuff. A lot of sites have wasted time, 6 to 9, man-months of time, development time on a release that in the next release the code was there from Cray and probably worked better, or for whatever reason their code no longer was good in a UNICOS system if they wanted to stay with UNICOS. Two of the most popular migration paths are GOS. GOS has been used at a variety of sites. I really can't just list the numbers, but GOS has offered the ability of continuing your COS services. I think Harwell was probably the first site that used GOS. And they were able to offer a stable COS production service. They were a service shop. And at the same time put friendly users onto their UNICOS side of the system. And this was UNICOS 1.0 and 2.0 and that time frame. I was there at the time, and the biggest problem they had was not with GOS, but with their terminals, because they were all 3270 terminals, and characters were not working correctly for C in the Unix environment, curly braces and things, backslashes, things that you couldn't get with your keyboard. And that's type of problems have been worked out in most cases, but it's going to really depend on in a lot of cases, the front end and the translation tables that are occurring on the front end and who maintains those being responsive to character problems. So the migration path GOS has been very useful in a lot of cases. Where it has not been useful is in machines that don't have enough memory, primarily. And 2 meg of memory is the tightest you can really go, 1 meg to each system. And you could do this at various hours, late evening and stuff like that, when the workload isn't as big on the GOS side, so that you can get your accounting system hooks done and things like that. But there are a lot of people that have gone native off hours, and balancing their schedule on a daily basis, saying these are the times we offer COS, these are the times we offer UNICOS. And on the COS side you have job backup capability, so you can bring down COS and offer just native UNICOS. Most typically though, native is being used in off hours, late night, early morning, weekend time slots, and done mostly for benchmarks after they've worked things out in the GOS environment. Then they go native and squeak it from there and use a dedicated environment to fine-tune the way the application's running. In benchmarking in UNICOS, you really want a predictable workload on the system so that buffer contention isn't a factor in a lot of your I/O statistics. Some sites have gone cold turkey. They just brought the UNICOS machine in and started from scratch. And in most cases, they had the luxury of a COS machine overlapping there. But in some cases, I've known of one site that went a whole month without any Cray service while their hardware was being changed. So we've seen it a lot of different ways. The most likable way is 2 separate machines having the hardware resources and putting an operating system on each and being able to connect everything together in the type of network you need. But not all sites have that luxury. Our real problem right now in the GOS environment is a lot of sites don't have the CPU cycles available to go. It's not a light issue to just tell them to go on weekends to UNICOS or something like that, because they can't give away that stuff. And as I mentioned before, there was one site that had a Gauss 82 job that runs for months as lowest priority in the system and just chews up idle time. And it's CPU seconds in some sites are very, very difficult to get. Disk drives are a consideration, but most sites do have the capability of giving up 1 or 2 disk drives. They're typically scratch or something like that, or adding on additional disk drives is a possibility. At some early point in this migration process, contractual and non-contractual situations occur. Licensing is very important. You want to get your UNICOS licensing started as soon as possible, 6 months ahead of time at least. You don't necessarily have to sign on the dotted line and pay for the license until about 2 months before the installation. At that point, then you get presented all the paperwork, and you could stall at that point or delay your installation. But if you're going to do it, you may as well get it done with and get the procurement done on a previous year budget, something like that. There are also, in a lot of migration situations, no hardware marketing things going on. They're not getting any new hardware. There's no contractual agreement involved in their migration. NASA Lewis was a case like this. And in these situations, you do have to deal with some understandings between the CRA staff and the customer so that everyone knows what's expected and what type of workload you expect, what are the key applications, this sort of thing. We're going to talk about that. Determining user interfaces and options. What tools are you going to offer them? How do you want them to implement their applications? Are you going to allow interactive versus batch? All these types of things. Are you going to allow VI? And we're going to talk about that. And involved in this interface options is the standards issue. I think each site has done this differently. Some have had rigid standards that they've tried to enforce. Others have just let the people go the way they want. The trouble with letting people go the way they want is they don't document it and they don't do it in a supportable fashion that's consistent with the way you want everybody to be able to support it, using proper documentation techniques, maintenance tools, things like that. Whether it's make files or NQS jobs to generate the binary or NQS jobs to run it or interactive, you have to come up with, usually in your user guide, a consistent way of presenting it to the people so that you can support them in a consistent way, so that they're all using the same basic tools and not all on their own, which makes it difficult for your support staff to help them when there's so many tools to choose from and so many things that you can do in the Unix environment, as well as the UNICOS environment. So standards is an issue that several sites are dealing with right now, and basically presenting their standards, not as standards, but as user guides to say, this is how we'd like you to do it, and put in documenting your code and all this sort of stuff. Performing the tasks is just one little notch here, but that's really the work, right? That's where the programmers sit down and start working on code. And that one's a tough one to predict. Hopefully in your assessment capabilities, you found all the hot spots, the accounting areas and things like that. And you can start working on some of these tasks before you have a UNICOS machine in shop, and come up to Mendota Heights and convert some of your key applications, and start working on the accounting system, learning about it and designing your model, putting your design specs together and stuff like that for what you're going to do. And finally, training the user community. That's where you now have UNICOS service available to your user community, and you have to train them on it. You really don't want to put users on the system until the system's ready, everybody's ready. You don't want to put them on, you don't want to teach them before the system comes in because they're not going to be able to apply it. You don't want to do it during the installation process because you want to control the workload and you want to control the way you're opening the system up to the user community. You want to really do it once things are satisfied or stable and squeaked to something that is feasible for that user community to use. Migration is really a training problem. It's really just a brainwash situation. Scrub their heads clean of everything they know about COS and teach them UNICOS, teach them a Unix-based system. And it's easier to teach a Unix person a UNICOS system than it is a COS person a UNICOS system. And this is true for analysts and that sort of thing as well. So training for the CRA staff should really begin as soon as possible, a year, 2 years before installation. Part of the problem right now, though, is at the administrative level, things are constantly changing with prior releases. With 5.0, I think it's going to be consistent with UDB Jan. But what those programmers, the analysts also have to deal with the C language, which may be new to a lot of them. And it takes time to get a person up to speed and comfortable in C. And then to get them into the internals itself and understanding how to maintain the kernel and stuff. All the products and libraries and stuff, they should be pretty comfortable with. It's really getting into the intricacies of the kernel and what to do when it breaks and what the tools are. One of the worst things that's happened on some sites is where the analysts are changing during the migration process, and a green person comes in as AIC and the other person is off on some other project, and shifting around of people that are involved in coordinating this migration that's going on. So training is a big one, and you want to do it on a stable system. Your project team. One of the first things you're going to do is identify your team leader. In most cases, this is a customer manager, programmer-oriented person. Not upper management or anything like that. So, though in one or two cases, upper management thinks they are. Okay. And team leader responsibilities are basically to organize and coordinate this team, to let the left hand know what the right hand's doing. That's what's most difficult, is when you've got so many different people, and programmers generally like to sit in their office alone and don't always talk to counterparts of theirs that may be useful in the project. So you want to make sure everyone knows what's going on, discussing problems. One person has a problem and finds a resolution, you want to be able to share that. And this person is also the one that's usually maintaining some sort of migration plan, types up the presentation they're going to make to their upper management or appropriate people, and also track time consumptions and basically be in charge of this whole migration. In 95% of the sites, it has been a customer person, not a Cray person, that's doing this and in charge of this. Because in the final end of this thing, they're the ones that are going to be responsible for what they have when they're done. And they want to be involved in those decisions. Now, your migration team is going to be made up of, I've got 3 groups here with some of the responsibilities. There's going to be a system support group. Now, in a lot of cases, this is just the Cray support people, the analyst in charge, etc. Now, every site is different, and there are a lot of sites that have system support people as well. I know that 01 does, has a lot of systems and operational support-oriented people. Databases that are written on Crays and a variety of different things that may be happening on site, as well as accounting, etc. I don't know about NCAR, but GOS is one thing that the system support people may be involved in, and typically 99% of the time this is the Cray analyst who's going to be the GOS person, because he's going to be the one to learn the code and ultimately support the problems. Tape support. The petroleum region has all kinds of tape support people that are involved in resolving and supporting tape problems on Crays. Networking. I think every computer center, computer shop has some sort of networking people that make sure everybody uses the networks appropriately. Archiving. There are a lot of sites where the archiving project was written in as local code. General Motors is one case where they have not PDM, they call it PDM1. And in a lot of cases, this is to support front-end backup rather than through Cray online tape, which is the way the archiving system is written in COS. So you're going to possibly have an archiving person that is involved in this. In a lot of cases, it may again be the Cray analyst. In the archiving area, that may be 50-50. Security. I think security is going to be a big concern at a lot of government sites, and they have a security officer basically who's in charge and pushes his way around with security issues. System performance. A lot of cases, that is the Cray analyst and possible benchmarkers that are involved in making sure the machine's running the way it should. At Lockheed, they have a group of people designed to just look at the statistics left in the system log and determine utilization and stuff like that. Data set migration, that may be a responsibility of the system group, but ultimately maybe down in the user interface group, but making sure that all those things work. Operational procedures, there are again a lot of sites that have operational scripts and Fortran programs and all that sort of thing. Tape databases, I think, is one of the tools that 01 has, a thing that they go through for a whole layer of language on top of COS, really. And accounting. Accounting is a big one. I think most every site has to tune their accounting and has that done by an outside person in conjunction with the CRA person. But I know there are a lot of sites where there's an accounting person who's writing the code to look at the accounting records and generate the reports and keep track of everything, and he's a customer person, support person, not a CRA person. So these are the types of people that you may have involved in this project that are going to have to implement the same thing in UNICOS or redesign it for UNICOS. The application group, there's usually some sort of applications analyst. It may be a CRA person in a lot of cases. There's also application support people. It sounds like we've got a couple in this class. They're going to deal with languages and compilers and libraries and loaders, what debuggers are available, the user interface to get the whole application working. And problems or confusion or whatever are going to have to come to them, and the CRA analyst or CRA applications analyst is usually involved there. Does NCAR have a CRA applications support person, or? Okay. The user interface group is typically different than the application support person, but they're the ones that, you know, coordinate the field or the user's community. And they're going to have a lot of work ahead of them because they're the ones that eventually talk to the user in a lot of cases. And it may, at a lot of sites, be one and the same person. Again, each site is different. But a lot of times the user interface group is more of a political person than a support programmer person. Okay? And that's why I classify the distinction there. This person is typically more of a possibly manager, often involved in the newsletter and all that sort of thing. And they're going to have to find out what applications do we run. Believe it or not, there are probably sites out there still that may know their top 5 applications that are heavily used, but don't really have a feel for everything every little project that's going on in their machine. I know in Mendota Heights we have no idea. That's one site. They're going to have to, you know, survey the users and find out what codes are you running. They may be involved in running COS JCL or a variety of other things and not look for COS specific stuff, but application runs and stuff like that. But they're probably going to have to be involved in possibly an online database that they can talk to their users and users can edit information for them, as well as just surveys, paper sent out. You want to find those codes that are calling get DSP, get LFT, people using SCOL, and gathering this information. How many people have CAL? If you're going to a CRA 2, that's something you're looking for. Now in the planning guide, we do have sample surveys as something to start with. One goes to the analyst, one goes to the application support people. There's also one in there that goes to the end user. Do you have large procedure libraries? That's another one you're looking for. And you may not have a realistic idea of what's out there. Because at this point, this is where you're determining who's going to be the hot spots in terms of time-consuming code conversion and what people are going to be real easy to deal with. They're also going to be involved in conversion tools. Do we want the menu system? Do we want COS help? Do we want just to give them a JCL converter? This person may be involved actually in maintaining the templates for COS help or something. You know, what is the user eventually going to see? This person's also, or people, also dealing with the user training, possibly the one that's coordinating the training and setting up the lectures and all that sort of thing. And a user guide. A lot of sites like CRA documentation, but every site is different and they have to tailor it. And I've seen German user guides, French user guides, ones from American sites as well. Generally, a site doesn't like to share their guide to anybody else, so they become very private. But they all have the same theme, and that's basically, here's how you get on the system, here's how you do your work, and here's how you get billed or get a login, that sort of thing. Then there's also going to be the conversion notes, the software migration notes, and any other online hint type of thing. News, in UNICOS there's the news command, and you can have this person putting in hints and things that have been found in the migration areas, particular problems, that sort of thing. And this is the type of audience that I usually have. When I go on site, I have a mixture of these people. Your site assessment, release level, compiler release levels isn't up here, station release levels. Your analyst will have to check that every station can talk to UNICOS if you intend to use the station link. I think most sites are at a level there. If it's a local station, a lot of sites have local stations or stations that have been modified by them. You have to know that so that you can determine that it's not going to be a problem coming into UNICOS. Audit can help you figure out and plan a good starting point possibly for the file system configuration. Who needs what kind of space, so that you can get an idea of how much space is being used by particular users. The problem may be in separating several users in the same ownership that are going to become possibly in separate file systems or something. So start planning how are you going to organize your COS file system concepts to UNICOS. And don't try to map it, but you're going to have basically the same sort of database more than likely that you're going to have to maintain on UNICOS, with overhead being a more critical thing in each file system area. So audit can help you, audit by ownership, and getting an idea of how much data you're actually using on disk. And extract, mostly the extract analysis for job size and COS JCL can tell you things about memory utilization and SCOL and S-switch. Look for anybody using sense switches. Survey users for the specifics. That's what the user interface group is going to do, possibly with their newsletter and an online method, whatever technique the site chooses. And sites do have online databases that they use for this type of stuff. They're going to evaluate, and this is the migration team kind of subdivided. They're going to migrate into take a look at the COS features that are not yet available in UNICOS. Now, a lot of these are. This obviously was done pre-4.0, but let's just say unique features or something like that. But archiving is available in 5.0. Security was available in 3.0, 4.0. Online tapes is really in final place in 5.0. System performance statistics, that hasn't really changed. In 5.0, the system activity report and all that is standard Unix statistics. CRAPERF-D, the statistics it shows are still the same. It's just the interface to the user is slightly different in CRAPERF. Operator interface is what are your operators going to be doing on site? What do they do in COS? The accounting. With 5.0, all the accounting is new, so your accounting people are going to have to get involved and see, well, how do we use all these tools now? I counted just now 15 CSA commands that are part of the CRAE system accounting package. So 15 commands that are brand new in 5.0 that have to be looked at, along with record types of job terminations, session records, USCP, NQS, tape accounting records, all kinds of stuff that's brand new in 5.0. So you're going to want to take a look at this stuff. Maybe it falls a little short of what you need. That's something that you have to look at. Superlink. And there are no Superlink sites in here, but that would be something that you'd have to take a look at. Is it going to, do what you need it to do? How much effort is there going to be involved in it? And user device driver is listed here. This is not available in UNICOS. Does NCAR use the user channel? It's the capability of doing an $F driver call, system action request, and connect a site-specific device on a low-speed iOS low-speed channel. And it was a feature that was initially used for the Superlink connection to the front-end interfaces. And I don't know of any site that's ever gone beyond that and used it in any other way with site-specific hardware out there. But that is not supported in UNICOS, and if you use that, it's something that you should flag. It can be supported. In other words, you can write the drivers to do it, and you'd have to know about Unix driver writing to do that. But it's not supported by default. Site assessment's also going to include, finding those applications that use unsupported library calls, possibly using $dummy-lib. The next page I have is 1410, is kind of a migration plan that I put together based upon what I've seen and being a little optimistic still, but typical time frames or whatever's going on in a migration process. And the center of the page is the installation point, where we open it up to more than one person basically and take it out of a installation mode into whatever you want to call it, pre-production mode. And the whole migration plan up here starts with CRE staff training. This is a difficult area at times because the CRE staff can't get off site. They're busy supporting the site to get through the couple months of training it takes to just get introduced to a UNICOS system. And hopefully if there's a UNICOS site in the area, then it makes it easier to bounce between machines and get training. But a lot of these analysts are out there on their own, hundreds of miles from the nearest UNICOS machine. And some of that staff training really should include some what's called the visiting analyst program, where analysts can come up to Mendota Heights and work in development for a little while and see how things work up here and stuff. Or they could go to another UNICOS site or go through the region to help support and get involved in other UNICOS installations going on. Petroleum region is starting to gear up in this area right now. They've been lagging because they've been waiting for tapes and the things that they need in 5.0. So that should begin as soon as possible. Migration team members, putting together the team, breaking into your subgroups and identifying, who's involved in what in this migration process. And you may or may not make these rigid responsibilities just areas of knowledge more than anything. Don't try to pin it to them as a job. That will vary from site to site. Gathering your site information, we're doing this, about 4 or 5 months before the installation. And a lot of that's looking at local code, getting an itemized list of these are the things that are going to be hotspots, that are going to take some local code development or something like that, because this is the way we wanted to do it. An interesting thing was at one site in the petroleum region, they have a diskless file system. Everything is data set catalog, everything is on the SSD for security reasons. They use no disks, period. And they wanted to do that in UNICOS. Well, they've been able to implement it up here in Mendota and prove that they could do it without any local code. And this is what I mean by planning those local things ahead of time, what's being done uniquely at our site from a vanilla COS release. So they haven't installed UNICOS, but they've resolved one of their problems already. Evaluate the COS features used, evaluate UNICOS features, start your licensing. Even AT&T, we had to pull UNICOS out of their shop because they did not have appropriate licensing. The Murray Hill, New Jersey lab did not have a Unix license, and we had to remove the, it was a pre-production system, and I think they weren't upgraded properly. But licensing can hold up the best of you. I mean, it just is a real bureaucratic slowdown in everything. Even if the code may be converted, getting licensing worked out on a third-party software package and things like that. One thing that will hold up a site is that one last application that a major number of people use, and it's somebody else's software outside of your shop. Evaluate site characteristics, and this is really how do we use it, what type of stations, site-specific code, what is it that's different about our site from all the other sites. At this point I mentioned implementing GOS. Now this whole plan is designed for a possible GOS implementation until a new machine comes in the door. This is really based upon a CRE 2 plan, but you can pull out the stuff that would not be appropriate for your site. But evaluating whether you want GOS, whether you've got the resources to use GOS, or maybe you've swung a contract for new hardware and have dual machines in the shop at the same time. Identify training requirements. By the way, GOS is still being looked at on YMPs and stuff. once the old machine goes out. With the YMP, you've got a lot more resources to split memory and CPUs and stuff. So, identify training requirements. This is where you're starting to get your system support people through the training, the accounting class, the internals overview, or the user level stuff, whatever it is, getting your site support people up to speed that may or may not be Cray employees. I've got in here then purchasing your licenses, and it's occurring about 2 months before the actual install. You can start your licensing, and that takes paperwork and all kinds of stuff that's done bureaucratically until you actually get the paperwork back, sign, and pay for it. That's when you're committed to the licensing fee. Upgrade close to appropriate release. This would be if you're looking at going up to 117 for UNICOS 4.0 or 5.0. That is really a site-specific thing. Some sites prefer to stay at the operating system they're at. Other sites have gone through two releases without the user community ever knowing it because it was so smooth. So different sites have done that differently. And a lot of sites prefer to stay in a stable environment because for the advantage of keeping their users on their side, so to speak. Freezing the COS, freezing what you got. No more new accounting code, no more operational-oriented stuff. I think I heard about at NCAR, or at least one site, talking to somebody, and they were talking about, well, I just wrote this code that does that. And I said, well, now you've got it, what are you going to do with it on UNICOS? Stop digging yourself into a hole in the COS environment. You've got to determine at what point, is it going to be, or when you're doing it, avoiding COS techniques that won't port easily. Thinking about that portability. Depends on what you're doing. Freeze COS, investigate which UNICOS release to install. At this point, 5.0 and 6.0 are the likely candidates, each to their own. I would expect 5.0 installations to start occurring all over this spring and summer. April, May, June, July, and there's going to be a real migration hump with the release of 5.0, of lots of people bringing it up on the system. So they should have already got their licensing going well before now. Then you decide on your migration path, figure out what method are we going to use as it goes. Order the UNICOS release that's appropriate for you, and then you start getting into, okay, we got this code that's going to be coming, let's figure out how we're going to implement it when it comes in the shop. Let's do some pre-implementation stuff, up in Mendota and stuff. You could get your user database scripts written and tested and, have your analyst or somebody come up here and run it on UDB Jan in a test mode and debug it and have your user database ready. And you've surveyed your users and all that stuff. You've got that information now online in a database ready for a UNICOS installation. File systems can be tested in Mendota Heights or in Chippewa Falls. Factory trials are real key to helping this if you've got a new machine coming in. Nothing wrong with having everything ready and working and applications running when you go to Mendota, or when you go to Chippewa, I mean. Use that time. Deciding on user interface options, you may want to actually draw that as starting earlier, but you're going to have to work out how are we going to let them use this machine. Are we going to let VI be used? All that sort of stuff. We're going to come back to that. Test your applications on UNICOS. That can be done up here or be done in the factory trial. You can start getting your code tested and running on UNICOS before you actually have the install. Then we've got install and test added hardware, NSC boxes, and FEI boxes to connect in. If you're an FEI only site, you may want to add a hyperchannel adapter. And disk drives are also another consideration in there. Disk drives will never hurt you in UNICOS. Build and test your UNICOS functionality. We're right at the install point there, and that's all analyst work. Those are the days he gets, 12-hour shifts. Freeze UNICOS after it is stable. At some point, you've got everything built, running, and working. Hopefully that is like a week A typical time might be a week for a stability period. Then we begin into our local feature development. Our systems programmers start doing their accounting stuff, and libraries people implementing theirs and presenting the interface that the users are going to see, getting that all tuned and ready. Start your UNICOS training. Start with some friendly users, some guinea pigs, that sort of thing. Then we've got the introduce UNICOS production service. This is occurring about 3 months after the install, where we're going from a pre-production mode to a production mode. And obviously that is a widely varied number depending upon how much work you have in local code. A site like Boeing has probably 50% local code and 50% COS code, and they've got a lot of work to do. Migrating our workloads to appropriate compilers and getting them off of COS into UNICOS occurring in here, that can stretch on. And then we go on with the benchmarks, the factory trial for a new machine, installing the new machine, and phasing the new machine service in. So that's where the overlap occurs with a new machine coming in. And in here, this was probably a GOS installation. That's the way this plan is laid out. But a Gantt chart can help you spot what's slowing you down and can help you see where realistically the work's going to go. Selecting your migration path. First of all, you can do all your preparation on COS. In the past, they always went to CFT77 and SegLoader on COS first. This is in particular for Cray2 sites coming in. So they know there's COS debugging tools. They know the COS library environment was stable, compiler, those sorts of things. And $dummylib can also be used on COS to find the applications that have major numbers of library calls unsupported, and then we can get them up here to Mendota and convert them here. Old and new hardware not at the site concurrently. Well, you can write PDS dump tapes, write whatever tape you want, and get it to another site. Get it to Mendota Heights and start converting it. COS read is very useful in reading PDS files. So they can write an online tape and then we can pull it apart. Old and new hardware at the site concurrently. That's the nice one. Not every site has that luxury realistically. Several sites have though, and it keeps them away from the next option, which is GOS. Keeping the same machine but running GOS. If you're in a GOS environment plan, you want to look at hardware upgrades such as adding disks, 2 disks maybe. They'll always be useful in UNICOS. Memory, tough thing is for older machines, Cray 1s, getting memory parts for them, so you may not have much of an option there. Front-end backup of data sets may be an option. If you're in a GOS environment, you could use the internal station, or do you want to put all your data sets on the front end? If that's where they're maintained, then that's probably where you're going to keep them. And also, a worse thing is going from an XMP to a 2. And one site went from COS, changed compilers on them, went to a GOS environment, then changed to native UNICOS, and then the Cray 2 came in, and you know the people had to go through several iterations of this phasing process. Another site did everything, changed the front end interface on them, changed the operating system of the front ends on Amdahl machines to a UTS. So the users didn't know editors anymore, didn't know their front end anymore, didn't know their mainframe anymore, didn't know their compilers anymore, and everything all at once. Hopefully your user community doesn't carry rocks around the halls or something, because you can make enemies that way. But there are differences between the X and the Cray 2, and if you optimized your code on the X, then the Cray 2 is going to be different optimization techniques in areas and different things in the libraries area and the way you do I/O and how you use a Cray 2. An XMP and a Cray 2 are different architectures and different machines, and they're optimized differently. Non-contractual agreements to deal with, an application acceptance list. Having up front, when this migration team is talking, a list of the codes that we're going to have to deal with. Now that may not be the only list. There may be additional applications, but at some point you don't want applications popping out of nowhere 5 or 6 at a time that you're going to have to deal with. You realistically want to know what codes do you expect to have running on UNICOS before you drop COS service. And this has been a problem on some sites because of people popping up with some new code that they have to have on the other system, and it's getting down to the wire. What you're trying to do is avoid the problems before they become problems. A workload stress test acceptance. What do you expect to be able to do with the machine? What type of performance do you expect before you go native? The networking capabilities. At one site, they did a workload stress test and nothing survived. And they never even got to UNICOS. It was NQS and USCP logging in and out because they were doing all their dataset staging on one DD29, and they were beating the disk drive to death. Once the site was reconfigured, they were able to, get into UNICOS and actually test its performance. So networking and the accessibility of your nodes out on the networks have to be involved in that expectation of what you can do with it. What training requirements do you expect? How many man-hours of trainers are you going to have? Is it going to be Cray training? Is it going to be local training? Both? The sooner you start figuring out 1,500 users, how are we going to best train them? And the time frame of your migration support. At what point are you willing to let any migration-specific support occurring on site to go on to the next site? It may be a regional support person that spends a lot of time there, or that sort of thing. In the regions with regional support, and in particular with the foreign subsidiaries, that's something they have to deal with more realistically because they don't have the resources. If they put somebody on site just for the 3 weeks of installation, and then he goes on to his next support issue, something like that. And a lot of times there's no contract involved in a migration if you're keeping the same hardware. And if you're getting new hardware, migration is often written into the contract, certain conditions and stuff. Just some licenses mentioned here. The AT&T System 5 Release 3 license, C compiler license. There are a variety of other licensing issues. Export licensing can take a lot of time for foreign sites. But licensing should all be done through the licensing department. There are changes from what I've got marked here. You don't need some of these licenses and stuff. Station licenses you may have to worry about as well. But site-specific libraries, that's an area where you're going to have to deal with licensing it for UNICOS with a third-party vendor. Your user interface options. NQS, USCP, TCP. Who's going to do what? With 5.0, you can turn off interactive access, allow it for 2 weeks. That's what I would recommend is if you do intend to stay in a batch environment, at least give them interactive to get their code implemented because they'll implement it quicker. And you want that. You don't want them bogged down with batch response or, you fire the job off and then see what happens and fire it off again and see what happens. You just want to run it with CDBX and walk through it. Some sites have installed TCP but did not allow users to use it. It was there just so that it was there, so that the resources were committed, so that if they wanted to go with TCP in the future, they were used to the resources, the memory, whatever it took to have it in there in the first place. And only the administrators and possibly support people used it. Users were not allowed to use it. But it was just because of the environment they were fitting in was not a TCP environment, but they thought that they would probably be adding a lot more TCP networking capability. So they wanted to start from the beginning and keep it in because they thought they'd have trouble getting it in later. People's concerns about what its impact would be.
Do you have any feeling for how much of a load the interactive use of the machine places on the machine? How many people can you comfortably support?
Well, I've seen 125 before I've started seeing system response slowdowns and stuff like that.
This is on a what?
I don't remember. We talked about this earlier this week. I think it was on the 218, but it's hard to remember specifically. It was not the Y, it was not a Cray 2. It was one of the XMP style machines that we have. Because everything I do is on XMPs.
Do you have any feeling for whether that degradation was caused by?
And we thought it was more network.
Or the network?
We thought it was more network at the time. That was the opinion. But we've got network monitoring stuff going on, etc. people watching the networks, and that's what showed up in our CCN letter describing the conditions that week. Our biggest problem is not getting to it, not, you know, the impact of it. You can even see the difference between being on an iOS console and being over any of these other networks, the Hyperbus and Hyperchannel and stuff. It's quite a bit faster there. And there's also HSX connections for TCP, so that you can connect using a HSX channel instead. But that's what I've seen, is around here things start going wrong. We do a who and a word count for a number of lines on it and get in the 120s before we, you know, start seeing something to complain about, other than simply not getting to it at all, which is hardware or software downtime. TCP can be configured, like for example in a Ghost environment, reduce the number of buffers that are allocated for TCP communications. It should be adjusted to the number of users you expect to use TCP. And the batch versus interactive issue. Most people think, well, it's an interactive system, I'm going to do the application interactive, and then they're waiting 15 minutes for the output. That shouldn't be an interactive application. Maybe in the future with the Cray 4, Cray 5s, things that were batch become interactive, but we're always going to have a programmer doing one step further and always have time-consuming code that can run forever. File system configuration, I mentioned that before. It's often a fight between different groups because they're on different file systems and they don't have enough space in their own file system. Applications in our area is always complaining because they don't have enough file space to run their applications. And they're all in the same department. They're all doing real work. So tuning that file system is a challenge, and every site has gone through several iterations. And I've got some documentation in that area. Man Pages VI is a supercomputer designed for word processing and displaying this type of stuff. Decision you have to make. You can leave it on the system for administrator and support people and just turn off permissions to the average user, or control it by compartments so that only certain people are allowed it. You hate to see a science project funded that chews up its cycle times on the project down to 0, doing stuff that could be done on a front end or something. And Cray is looking at putting man pages in the front end and Emacs and distributed processing techniques. Default compiler, I think CFT77 is the preferred choice for future machines. Do it now. You may offer CFT as well, but you may be, you know, splitting your audience. That's a choice you have to make. The default loader, making people use SegLoader. SegLoader with BLD will be faster, and BLD being the library maintenance tool, that gives you faster link times, and then people aren't eating up cycles for things that they don't need to do. The debugger, the only debugger now is CDBX. I've provided you with some CDBX handouts, and that's the only debugger to talk about. And whether you want the menu system. Personally, I would rather put on COS help than use the menu system. Menu system might be something you tune for operators or something. The next page, the application conversion steps, we've already gone through in the first section. You run and test it on COS so that you know it works on COS first. Save its output because you're going to compare that on UNICOS. Transfer it to UNICOS. Your network determines what method you're going to get it onto UNICOS. My last application class, I had an MS-DOS disk that we loaded onto an IBM and used Kermit to put it onto the pyramid and then onto UNICOS. So whatever way you get it there. Decide on implementation choices. Split it into a gen job, turn that into a makefile to generate the binary, and then a run job, which could be a shell script or an NQS job or both. You can run an NQS job as a shell script interactive. The NQS stuff is taken as comments. So it's compatible with both systems. Convert your JCL to UCL. COS help can help you do that. Most cases, every site has said JCL is not the problem. That nobody's bothered by the JCL problems of converting the JCL. Where they get slowed down in is library calls. missing library calls. Memory is a popular one that's missing, has been missing. Compiler differences, typically I haven't seen those. The same warning messages come out of both compilers, being a COS compiler versus the UNICOS compiler. Obviously, CFT and CFT77 could hit different warning messages. Load errors. Typically, this is our missing COS routines. That's where you start going, oh no, I've got all this work to do. The type of calls you make are what's going to determine how much time it's going to take. Calling JCL statements is one-liner changes. Calling get DSP, get LFTs, things like that. Calling system could be a real-time consumer. Sense switches, reprieve processing, those types of things in the application can really take time. Run your static debugging tools. Typically, we just, once we've got this thing linked, we execute it and see what happens. At that point, you're really debugging an executable binary. You may want to go back and use octal dump to look at the data set structures to make sure that they're in proper format, that sort of thing. I/O differences is the next thing that usually slows us down, figuring out why this thing's failing and understanding the I/O debugging techniques. And now that we have procstat available, it makes it a little easier to get some information. Then you go on to verifying the output. Hopefully all the numbers are the same. If it's one number in 10,000, you've got a little bit of work of figuring out what went wrong in that iteration of the calculations. Benchmarking the application, both CPU and I/O information. The I/O stuff should be done in a dedicated mode because system buffering is going to be variant on the workload and who's using the system buffers. And hopefully multitask the application. Use auto-tasking and get a quick payoff, and you didn't have to do much work. You just added a couple of statements. Training that's going to make this migration smoothly. Obviously, in the past 2 days you may have discovered, oh, this is what it means in UNICOS, how this is done in UNICOS. We've tried to map everything in UNICOS that can be in COS that can be done in UNICOS. And a lot of people that are concerned about going to this Unix-based operating system simply haven't been trained properly to know what the capabilities are and how something they did in COS is going to look in UNICOS. You're going to have several different types of training going on. The site analyst should go right away. C is a big thing to get them up on. Using C, writing C, reading C, particularly in the kernel. But it could be on a COS system, just maintaining some C products. You know, you don't learn an operating system and a language all in 3 months and start from scratch, unless you're really, really good and probably had some experience before with all the other Pascals and variant languages, so you had something to start with. Generally, it takes longer for a COS analyst to come up to speed on a UNICOS system than it does a Unix analyst, because he understands Unix and he understands kernels. And there are a lot of changes for him, but he's thinking in a Unix mode. And it's really a philosophical or a psychological attitude about the philosophy about the system and the way you think. Identify your customer staff people. Managers may need some training. Administrators in particular. A lot of sites have customer administrators that add users to the database and this sort of thing. They're going to have to learn UDB Gen. System programmers. All system programmers should be programming in C in the UNICOS environment. A lot of sites do it in Fortran, stuff like that. I mean, any system hooks you do, accounting tools, things like that should be in C so that you can use the structure headers. So you don't have a problem of every time a structure is changed on UNICOS, the application can't figure out the format of the file. And some sites have real problems with this in COS because they send their structures off to the front end and analyze it on the front end and have no way of looking at COS to figure out what that structure is. So header files and things like that can be shared in the C environment a lot easier. Applications programmers, they may need to know about system calls and libraries and things like that. Operators, there is a 2-day operators class that can be given.
And finally, your end users come of three varieties. Those with Unix background need very little training. You just give them if everything you know about COS, you'll find it in UNICOS, and give them the documentation, and they love hacking. They enjoy it. People with COS generally need a little bit more hand help. They need to be coached and looked over their shoulder a lot more to see if they're going in a Unix fashion of implementation. And then the end user with no software background who probably just wants a VI course and something simple like that. The last thing I wanted to mention here now are the training courses and explain what they are. MIGRO is a migration course I offered that is just designed for a one-day non-technical migration planning stuff, typically for management. I've only delivered this once to a site. Migration planning is what we've gone through in the past 2 days, minus the terminal stuff. And it's basically delivered mostly on site to the migration team to give them all the information that they need and try to get a unified approach so that everybody has access to the information they need for their area. I offer a COS Ghost class, which is a 2-day internals and operations class with lab, and you can come up and learn about GOS. The MIGR course is the same course as this course. It just adds the terminal exercises. The workbooks are identical. Its only intent is to take a 2-day lecture class that can be delivered anywhere, turn it into a 5-day practical terminal class that could be delivered wherever there's UNICOS, and deal with the migration tools. I call it a tools usage. And in the next 3 days, we're going to get into using the tools, and each one of you will specialize in whatever project you want. There's a UNICOS accounting class. Right now, it is still 4.0, so I wouldn't recommend taking it until it's 5.0. And there's an application conversion class. The application conversion class is designed to simply get the code converted. Some people do it in the MIGR class. But the migration class is more system migration team oriented, whereas the AppCon class is more user oriented. And in there we talk about CDBX, and we talk about library issues, auto tasking, performance tools, and it's designed to walk an end user through the migration of his application. And this one deals with the migration tools, this MIGRP class. The AppCon class, I don't want to talk about the tools. I tell them COS help is there and that's it. And then they just get converting their codes. So the AppCon class is coming up in 2 weeks, and I know a couple people are coming back for that. Bring your codes. That's what it's for. Its intent is to give you as much terminal time as you need to get your codes converted. So that's all we have in terms of workbook, and the anthology is something that you can look in on your own. From this point on, we're just going to pick up some specialty topics and talk about some auto tasking in the next couple days, and whatever you want to specialize in. So that's the end of the lecture portion in terms of what the workbook has. Are there any questions on anything? I mean, this has basically walked you through the tools, compared the systems, and then here's how you put this all together into a plan for your site and a way of approaching the migration, and what steps to do. I might point out the migration planning guide has a lot more detailed information on the steps and checklists and all that sort of thing as a guide to help you coordinate your migration. There was one final thing I thought I'd mention. There's a new migration document that we're working on, SMN 7023, and I've mentioned this before. This is designed to compare the operational administrative aspects of the systems. It's designed for administrators, not end users. So it'll compare all your COS administrative commands to UNICOS. It'll compare file systems. Extract, how do you do extract in UNICOS? And a lot of people have been wanting this information. A lot of the preliminary information to this is in your workbook, in the cross-references and stuff. But I hope to get to you some newer stuff by the end of the week, and that includes the archiving and resource management areas. So keep an eye out for that. It should be out end of February, something like that. And that would be for your systems people that have to convert operational-oriented stuff to UNICOS.
Will it help people like
Well, that's a tough one, yeah.
And you mentioned that a lot of that information just wasn't being kept.
Right, exactly. A lot of the information isn't being kept. Account com is the only thing that you've got to see that the process ran. 5.0 may have some more information, and that is a good point. We've always thought that that was more of an analyst type or systems person that did that, but yeah, it's true. The applications support people have to do that too.
Well, we use it an awful lot.
Yeah, that's been a hot issue in, comparing the two systems, because in COS, if a job fails, you can go find out what happened. Number of externals not satisfied, all that goody kind of stuff. In UNICOS, the hooks are there, but the system isn't configured to do that. You can use syslog daemon and have the shell and various other people, products, stuff like that, write to the syslog daemon and then log it off on the network somewhere. But it's not built that way. UNICOS has the capability, but isn't hooked up that way. And a lot of sites do want that. Presently, what would probably be desired would be the accounting class, or taking a look, getting an accounting workbook, because the accounting workbook covers all the logs that are maintained by the system. It's designed to compare extract. It doesn't mention extract anywhere in it, but every topic in it is related to an extract topic. And that's what I designed it for. So hardware stuff is in there, error messages. The $log stuff, though, that's the tough one, since there isn't much kept.
So what you're saying then is that perhaps somebody could write some local code that would in fact
Somebody could.
get the information.
Yes, it can be done. And it's not so much local code as simply putting lines, hooks into the existing code. Not any new modules as such. You simply put hooks into the products like the shell and write the shell with that verbose mode into the syslog daemon files. And it would be a syslog daemon writer that would know how to open and close and maintain logs with the syslog daemon. And they're all text logs, you see. And that's the way you'd have to do it. So the person go in and modify SH, and wherever the verbose mode is being tested or handled in the shell, he'd put in the hook to say, I don't care if verbose mode's set or not, let's write this to the syslog daemon, or force it to verbose mode, that sort of thing, which is ugly interactive, but you could make a test, and that's another determination. Do you want this tracking for interactive or batch or both? You possibly want it only for batch, so that interactive performance is better and stuff. So the real work, once the application's running this stuff, number crunching, all this stuff is gone, so the overhead isn't involved necessarily in the actual run of the application. It's getting up to the application and when the application finishes. Before and after, the real number crunching occurs, in my opinion. It's like a get param call. The overhead is once when you start it up, and then you don't have any overhead involved in the benchmarking or the run of the number crunching portion of the code. But dealing with $log is a tough one, because the only thing you can really do is force the user to keep those outputs, or use account com, which doesn't tell you much of anything, that sort of thing.
What was that book again, or that, or the accounting book that you mentioned?
Yeah, it's a TRUACC. That's in the page 22. TRUACC. But that is a 4.0 version right now. But there are a number of things in 5.0 I was noticing for NQS jobs, whether it finished or not, and things like that. So there was a lot of new information in 5.0 that would be a lot more useful to you, but it's more of on the accounting side than it is a troubleshooting utility for an application support person. It's more for billing, and if the job didn't finish, we're not going to bill them type of issue than applications person going in and saying, oh, you're right, it didn't finish. Well, why didn't it? And finding, you can go into the CFT and write
to the system log, syslog daemon, you know, with various areas of the compiler that may be problems and things like that. Every time a user hits a particular error message that you know is consistent out there, you could write to the syslog daemon and also notify the operator. But these kind of hooks do not come with a vanilla UNICOS release. Anything else? We